Hello, everyone. I'm the storyteller, and I'm here to accompany you today. I know you're watching this video to relax or help you sleep. So first, please like and subscribe. Where are you from? What time is it? Relax, unwind, and enjoy the moment. My grandmother told me a scary bedtime story. Years later, I found out that the story she told me was horrifyingly true. It is weak. I watched from a distance while my grandma and grandpa fished on their lake in the backyard, but one thing confused me. While grandpa cast his line and watched his rod, waiting for the anticipating tug of a fish, grandma's gaze remained fixed across the lake, her head tilted intently towards the dark fringe of woods. I never saw her look at the bobbing lures. She didn't even seem interested in fishing at all. I thought that maybe she just simply enjoyed looking at the trees, but a nagging feeling persisted. There was more to her gaze than a simple love for nature. It was summer break, and I decided to spend it at my grandparents' house in Knoxville, Tennessee. They lived in a two-story house, recently built in 2018. It connected directly to a lake, with a dock jutting out on the far right side, where my grandpa kept his bass boat. My grandparents were a sweet and quiet couple. They kept to themselves most of the time, living a peaceful life in their little corner of the world. Every summer, though, my visits became a tradition. Grandma's invitation was always an automatic yes, her warm smile and gentle voice, a beacon calling me back. There were countless things to love about my grandma, her kindness and generosity at the top of the list. If I wanted something, it was usually an automatic yes from her too. But one of the things I truly cherished most was her stories. Unlike Grandpa, who mostly stuck to tales of his time in the military, exciting stories filled with bravery and adventure, of course, Grandma was a bottomless well of stories. Whether it was a funny story from her childhood, a heartwarming story about a kind neighbor, or a fantastical bedtime story that transported me to magical lands, Grandma always had one on hand. She was one of those special grandmas who could weave a story from thin air, her words painting vivid pictures in my mind. Grandpa, on the other hand, was a man of few words. A quiet strength emanated from him, and the stories he did tell were always about his service. He'd talk about the places he'd been, the challenges he'd faced, and the lessons he'd learned. While not as fantastical as Grandma's stories, they held a different kind of magic, a testament to his resilience and the experiences that shaped him. One of the things I always admired about Grandpa was his outdoor skills. He'd tell me most of his knowledge came from his military training, jokingly saying they prepared him for anything. He was a true outdoorsman, the kind of person I'd trust implicitly if we were ever lost in the wilderness. He knew everything about fishing, the best spots on the lake, the best techniques to catch different types of fish. Some of my favorite memories were spent on his boat, cutting through the cool morning water, the sun rising over the horizon, and the gentle hum of the motor, a comforting lullaby. Tao. Every night, Grandma dipped into her seemingly endless well of stories. I never quite understood how she did it. Her mind was like a sprawling library, shelves overflowing with stories to tell. One night, she'd tell me a story of brave knights seeking vengeance, their swords gleaming in the sun. Another night, she'd tell me a story of a land shimmering with magic spells and cursed lands. Then there were the scary stories. Now, Grandma usually avoided them. She knew how they affected me. But the thing about those stories was the detail. Oh man, the detail. They were so vivid, so real, it felt like I was peeking through a crack into another world. A world where the monsters and creatures she described lurked. A world so terrifying that I felt like falling through that crack would kill me. Every night was the same routine. Nestled under a patchwork quilt in the guest room, I'd wait with bated breath. The soft click of the doorknob was my cue. Grandma, her face etched with a lifetime of stories, would enter, a gentle smile gracing her lips. She'd pull up a rocking chair, its rhythmic creak adding to the lullaby effect. Then, in a warm voice, she'd begin telling me a story. One night, though, tucked under the patchwork quilt, I waited for Grandma's nightly visit. The soft click of the doorknob announced her arrival. "Ready for another story?" she asked, her voice a warm rumble. I nodded eagerly. Nights at Grandma's were journeys to magical lands, each story more thrilling than the last. But tonight, I craved a different kind of story, a different kind of excitement. "Can you tell me a scary story tonight, Grandma?" I blurted out. A flicker of surprise crossed her face, followed by a thoughtful pause. Unlike her usual repertoire of action-packed adventures, her stories have always steered clear of scary ones. She sat beside me on the patchwork quilt, her usual mischievous eyes replaced by a thoughtful gaze. Her eyes flickered towards the window for a moment before returning to me. Then, with a gentle smile, she began. "Those woods outside your window," she started, her voice a warm rumble. I instinctively glanced towards the window, the familiar silhouette of the trees outlined across the lake. "There's something in those woods," she continued, her voice dropping to a hushed whisper. A shiver danced down my spine, though the room remained pleasantly warm. Those simple words made me so uncomfortable that I was tempted to just tell Grandma to stop. But the truth was, I was hooked. Grandma did tell me scary stories on rare occasions, but they were always fictional, completely disconnected from the real world. She continued, "Every 7 years, it comes out of those woods. It emerges, a creature that's been on this earth for thousands of years. It crawls on all fours. It hunts, a silent predator searching for its prey." I began to tense up a little. The room remained quiet, but the air felt heavy. "Its body is like a man, but twisted and contorted," she murmured, "and its limbs elongated, reaching out at odd angles. Its skin is black as coal, making it difficult to spot during the night." I swallowed hard, my eyes instinctively drawn back to the window. The trees, once comforting, now seemed to writhe with unseen shadows. "But the worst part," she continued, her voice barely a tremor, "is its eyes, multiple eyes, scattered across its head like a spider. They pierce the darkness, searching for an unsuspecting victim." She continued, her voice a hushed whisper, sending shivers down my spine. "Sometimes, if it has trouble finding prey, it ventures closer, closer to houses, searching for unlocked windows." My breath caught in my throat. The image of eyes peering through the glass sent a jolt of terror through me. "If it finds an opening," she murmured, "it will crawl inside and snatch the closest person to it, dragging them back to the woods." I squeezed my eyes shut, the warmth of the quilt a poor barrier against the sudden chill. "It keeps its victims alive for 7 long years," she whispered, "feeding off them slowly until the hunger returns, and it's time to hunt once more." My grip tightened on the blanket, and my knuckles were white. A cold sweat was dripping down my skin. "But don't you worry," she said, her voice gentling. "As long as we keep the windows locked, we'll be safe. And don't forget to do the same at your mom's house." She rose from the quilt, her smile strained at the edges. A smile meant to reassure, but one that couldn't hide the sliver of unease in her eyes. Her movements seemed slow and deliberate as she walked towards the window. My eyes followed her, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. She stared out of the window for a moment, as if checking to make sure the thing wasn't around, and then she checked to make sure the window was locked. Just as she was about to turn away, I blurted out, unable to contain the question that had lodged itself in my throat. "Grandma, have you ever seen it?" She paused for a few moments, a flicker of something unreadable crossing her face before a reassuring smile crept onto her lips. She didn't answer me. She simply leaned down and kissed my forehead, a gesture filled with a strange intensity. "Good night, darling," she whispered. Then, with a gentle click, she shut my door behind her. I was awake for most of that night, staring at the darkened window pane. The familiar silhouette of the woods outside now held a new kind of terror. I kept wondering if I would see that face my grandma described, a face with multiple eyes staring back at me. Eventually, exhausted from fear and lack of sleep, my eyelids drifted shut, and I finally drifted off. While I slept, I dreamt of its form shifting and writhing in the darkness. I ran, my legs pumping, but it was like I was running on ice. Panic seized me as the figure lunged, its long arms wrapping around my legs. It dragged me, a rag doll, through the grass, the stench of damp grass filling my nostrils. The woods grew bigger as the thing dragged me there, its jagged edges threatening to devour me whole. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. Just as the branches of the trees were about to engulf me, I jolted awake, gasping for breath. Light streamed through the window, painting familiar shapes on the ceiling. The room held a peaceful stillness. It took several deep breaths to slow the pounding of my heart. Relief washed over me, chasing away the lingering dread. Since that night, despite Grandma's steady stream of new stories, the creature in the woods has remained a constant shadow in the corner of my mind. Thankfully, the nightmares, those terrifying chases through endless woods, didn't last. Slowly, the story faded from memory. A few years later, a different kind of darkness descended upon our family. Cancer, a cruel, selfish thief, stole my grandmother's health bit by bit. She fought for months, but in the end, the disease won. It left a hole in our lives, especially for Grandpa. Now, he lives alone, the silence of the house heavy with her absence. Talking about her seems to bring a fresh wave of pain, etched deep into the lines on his face. Sometimes he murmurs about just waiting for his turn to join her. It's a heartbreaking sight. A man transformed into a solitary figure, simply waiting to die. That year was a blur of grief, a dark tunnel we all had to navigate. But, with the love and support of family and friends, we eventually managed to pull through. With each passing year, the grief lessened, but Grandma's memory remained. Then, after another few years, during my senior year in high school, something happened. I walked into the house after a long day. The familiar scent of an empty house greeted me. Mom had already left for work. Pulling my backpack onto my bed, I pulled out my books and settled in for an evening of homework, studying, and the occasional break to watch TV. I shut off the TV, changed into my pajamas, and crawled into bed. Sleep, however, remained elusive. My mind was a tangled mess, tossing and turning over the events of the day. Finally, I peeked at the clock on my desk, its green glow reading almost 3 a.m. Just then, a sound shattered the silence, a sharp tap that echoed through the room. My eyes flew open, snapping towards the window. A wave of ice washed over me, freezing my blood solid. Memories of Grandma's story flooded back. The creature, the woods. There, pressed against the glass, was a form that blocked most of the moonlight from filtering in. If not for the sliver of moonlight peeking in around what was blocking it, I wouldn't have been able to see it at all. Its human-shaped body pressed against the window, and across its head, I could have sworn I saw movement. A flicker, like multiple tiny insects scurrying across its flesh. Then, a horrifying realization dawned on me. They weren't insects. They were eyelids. Eyelids flickering open and shut, scanning my room with frantic urgency. My breath hitched. Was this a dream? Just then, a shadowy limb, long and impossibly thin, snaked out towards the base of my window. Had I locked the window? The sickening sound of the window, as the glass began to slide up, hit my ears. Terror choked and screamed in my throat. There are woods behind my mom's house, too, and a sickening realization dawned on me. This wasn't just a story. It was real, and it was here. Adrenaline surged through me, and my flight or fight responses kicked in. I threw myself out of bed in a desperate scramble. My feet pounded the floor as I bolted towards the door, flinging it open, but my escape was cut short. The door slammed shut in my face, the force of it throwing me backward. A strangled cry escaped my lips as a wave of terror washed over me. My body locked up, and every muscle seized in a silent scream. Somehow, it was now in my room, that fast. It was no longer at the window. It was now above me, above my door. One of its grotesquely long limbs, tipped with a hand like a spider's claw, pressed firmly against the door, pinning me inside. Another seemed contorted at an unnatural angle, its fingers splayed against the wall in a grotesque parody of a grip. The head, if you could call it that, twisted on its neck in a way that defied human anatomy, almost spinning completely around. A chorus of eyes locked onto me. Trapped and alone, I stumbled back, my mind scrambling for any flicker of hope. The second floor was an escape route, but a leap out the window would likely result in injury, leaving me in a vulnerable position. Besides, that's where it probably wanted me. Right next to the door stood my wooden baseball bat. In a desperate lunge, I grabbed it, the wood rough against my grip. With a yell, I swung the bat with all my strength, connecting with a sickening thud. Splinters of wood rained down as the impact sent a tremor through the room. The creature recoiled slightly, its multiple eyes flickering in what might have been surprise. But the silence that followed was the most unsettling part. No roar of pain, no growl. This thing moved with an unnatural quiet. Even as it moved, it made no noise. It descended to the floor, its grotesque form dwarfing the space in my room. As it loomed closer, lowering its body in a predatory crouch, I swung the mangled bat wildly. The bat connected with a bone-crunching impact, sending more shards of wood flying through the air. The creature recoiled, its grotesque form momentarily faltering. Seizing my chance, I bolted past the thing, flung open the bedroom door, and slammed it shut behind me with a resounding bang. Adrenaline pumping, I raced down the stairs, each step echoing in the sudden silence. Reaching the living room, I fumbled for the light switch, illuminating the space with a warm glow. Panting, I gripped the broken bat like a lifeline. Its splintered end pointed towards the top of the stairs, towards the thing in my room. Suddenly, a new sound pierced the tense silence. The creak of the front door opening. A silhouette emerged from the doorway, the dim porch light casting long shadows across her face. "There you are!" My mom's voice laced with exhaustion. "What the hell are you?" The sentence died on her lips, completely cut short. Her eyes widened, but neither she nor I had time to react. In a sharp and quick moment, a shadowy, distorted limb, tipped with a spidery claw, shot out, wrapping around my mother's waist. It snagged her, sinking its talons deep into her flesh, a sickening tear echoing in the sudden silence. A strangled noise bubbled in her throat, cut short before it could form a scream. But then, I heard her scream fully formed as the thing dragged her away to the woods. I ran with all my effort, but the thing was fast, too fast. All I could do was keep running, watching, as my mom screamed with her arms folded around the creature's arm in a desperate attempt to escape. It had her, though, exactly where it wanted her, out in the open. I fell face first into the grass, a sob wrenching its way out of my chest. Warm tears streamed down my face, blurring my vision as I watched in horror. Mom's screams turned into blood-curdling shrieks, fading into a horrifying silence. As they disappeared into the indistinguishable maw of the woods. The police came, but what could they do? What could I tell them? I told them exactly what I saw. They looked at me like I was crazy, but what else could I say? For hours I sat in a sterile interrogation room, the harsh overhead light blurring my vision. They questioned me over and over, dissecting my story, searching for inconsistencies. But all I could do was repeat the horrifying scene, my voice cracking with each retelling. There was no evidence to tie me to my mom's disappearance, nothing but my frantic pleas and the raw terror etched onto my face. Finally, they seemed to reach a reluctant roadblock. With a sigh and a dismissive glance, they released me. Now, a search party combs the backyard, venturing into the dense woods behind our house. Bloodhounds sniff the damp earth, their mournful howls echoing through the trees. In my room, the silence pressing down on me like a physical weight. As the harsh light of dawn breaks, I stare at the window. A large handprint, a grotesque splayed imprint of multiple fingers, clings to the outside of the glass. A cold realization settles over me. Now I know that at least one of my grandma's stories is real. As I stared at the horrifying imprint on my window, an imprint that only reminded me of the horror that just happened. A spark flickered in the corner of my mind. I remembered something Grandma said when she first told me the story of the creature. It keeps its victims alive for 7 long years. What kind of life could she possibly have in the clutches of that thing? Still, there was a possibility. However slim, it was still enough to ignite a sliver of determination within me. I wouldn't let her become another one of its forgotten victims. I had to find her. I trudged outside, the weight of dread clinging to me like a magnet. The backyard was filled with activity. Numerous detectives in crisp blue uniforms combed the woods, their movements purposeful, yet unearthing nothing. My gaze landed on a larger huddle of detectives near the tree line. They stood in a tight circle, their expressions grim. Curiosity gnawed at me, and I inched closer. As I approached, their hushed voices reached my ears, laced with a mixture of urgency and dread. Then I saw it. A single horrifying furrow gouged into the earth, an undeniable drag mark. My body tensed up. It snaked its way toward the dense woods, a testament to the horror that unfolded just hours ago. The mark ended abruptly at the tree line, swallowed by the thick undergrowth. It was a chilling sign, a confirmation of my worst fears, but also a single, undeniable clue. The nagging suspicion wouldn't leave me. If Grandma knew about the creature, then surely Grandpa must too. He'd retreated into a shell of silence ever since losing her. But maybe, just maybe, there was a missing piece of the puzzle locked away in his grief. I got into my car. The radio sputtered static, a monotonous hum mirroring the disquiet churning in my gut. My grandparents' house loomed ahead, a familiar sight now shrouded in an unsettling aura. Grandpa was already outside, a cigarette dangling from his lips. A forced smile stretched across my face as I approached him. "Hey, Grandpa," I said, the cheerfulness sounding hollow even to my ears. He grunted a greeting, his eyes clouded with a sadness that mirrored the one gnawing at me. "Can we talk inside?" He stubbed out his cigarette. Sure," he mumbled, avoiding my gaze. The house felt empty without Grandma around anymore. It's the same way it felt in my mom's house. The air was thick with unspoken words. "Haven't seen you around lately," he finally said, his voice raspy. "How are you holding up?" "I've been better," I admitted, the weight of the situation pressing down on me. I sat down, the familiar creak of the chair a jarring sound in the suffocating silence. Taking a deep breath, I plunged right into the conversation. "There's something I need to ask you about Grandma. Did she ever tell you a story about a creature?" His body tensed, a flicker of something akin to fear crossing his face. He looked away, his jaw clenching tight. "A story?" he finally managed, his voice barely a whisper. I held his gaze, refusing to back down. "The one about—" My throat tightened. "The thing in the woods." His face drained of all color, as if his heart had plummeted into his chest. "It got your mom, didn't it?" The question hung heavy in the air. I could only manage a slow nod, tears welling up and blurring my vision. They spilled over, tracing warm tracks down my cheeks. Grandpa remained silent for a moment, a hand cupping his face in what seemed like a combination of regret and frustration. Then, with a deep sigh, he lowered his hand and met my gaze. "Then we have to find her before it's too late." He got up from his chair and disappeared into one of the darkened rooms. The house creaked and groaned as he moved, the silence amplifying the anticipation gnawing at me. He returned moments later, a leather-bound journal clutched in his hand. He settled back into his seat, a grim expression etched on his face. He placed the journal on the coffee table with a trembling hand. "Your grandma wrote about it," he continued, his gaze flickering nervously toward the darkened hallway that led to the back of the house. "A story about a creature, saying it used to stalk the woods near her house when she was a little girl. She claimed it moved, searching for prey." His voice trailed off, replaced by a shallow cough that racked his thin frame. "She told me it travels to different areas," he finally managed, his eyes locking with mine for a fleeting moment. "That's why she was so hesitant about buying this house. Sure, the lake in the backyard was nice, but there were the woods, always the woods. That's where it lives," she'd tell me. It's the one thing she always nagged at me about, the feeling of unseen eyes watching us. But, well, I brushed it off. I told her she was letting childhood stories get the better of her. He shook his head, the movement slow and defeated, and kept it down for a while, his labored breathing the only sound in the tense silence. His voice, when he spoke, was laced with a raw determination that sent shivers down my spine. "Follow me," he said, rising from his chair. I scrambled to my feet, wiping away the tears that streamed down my face in a futile attempt to clear my vision. My grandpa, the man who usually moved with quiet deliberation, now pulsed with frenetic energy. We reached the basement door, I was never allowed to go in there during my childhood summers. It's only for adults, he'd always say, securing the padlock with a stern finality. Now, with a single turn of his hand, the lock yielded, revealing the unknown depths below. A single bare bulb flickered to life as he pulled the light string. The harsh yellow glow illuminated a scene that sent a jolt of fear through me. Guns, an arsenal of them, lined the walls. A hunting rifle I remembered from childhood hung next to a pump shotgun and a well-worn .22 pistol I vaguely recognized as the one he'd used to teach me to shoot years ago. A horrible realization dawned on me. This wasn't a simple search. My grandpa's eyes, burning with a desperate resolve, told a different story. This was a mission fueled by vengeance, a descent into the darkness to confront the creature head-on. The reality of what we were about to face washed over me, and a cold dread settled in my stomach. We were going hunting, but the prey was unlike anything I could have ever imagined. I stood there, frozen, a silent scream trapped in my throat. My grandpa moved with practiced efficiency, his hands unlocking a series of metal cages lining the basement wall. My fingers instinctively twitched as my heart pounded in my chest. My gaze darted towards the weapons, then back to my grandpa. He finally settled on a weapon, an AR-15, with a scope and a makeshift grip. He held it with surprising ease, years of experience etched in the way his trained fingers cradled the deadly tool. He turned, the glint in his eyes a harsh contrast to the worry etched on his face. "I know what you're thinking," he rasped, his voice rough. "You probably think I'm crazy." He was right. This entire situation was insane. Yet here we were. But what else of a choice do we have? He continued, his voice tight with desperation. The truth of his words slammed into me. The police investigation was a dead end, and my mom's life hung in the balance. It was a desperate gamble, going into the woods armed with nothing but hope and bullets, but it was the only chance we had. Before I could voice my doubts, the words tumbled out of my mouth, a confession laced with fear. "I've never shot an assault rifle before." A flicker of surprise crossed my grandpa's face. Then a grim smile settled on his lips. "That's why I'll teach you," he said, a hint of his old confidence returning. "You learned to shoot the .22. I don't see why you wouldn't be able to learn this." He gave me a different weapon, a semi-automatic rifle with a worn stock. It looked older, more familiar, the kind of gun I'd expect him to be using, not me. "Here, try this one out," he said, his voice gruff. "Let me know if you like the feel of it." Hesitantly, I wrapped my fingers around the grip. The cool metal sent shivers down my spine. Following his instructions, I located the magazine release and popped it open, revealing an empty chamber. Closing one eye, I lined up the sights, aiming at the blank wall across the basement. The act felt strangely empowering, a tiny flicker of defiance against the overwhelming fear that gnawed at me. I followed Grandpa toward the back of the basement, a knot of suspense tightening in my stomach. He swung open a door, revealing a dimly lit shooting range. Rows of paper targets hung on the far wall, riddled with bullet holes, a display of his countless training sessions long past. "Here's where you'll train," he said, his voice gruff but reassuring. He handed me a rifle, its weight unfamiliar in my trembling hands. "All right," he continued, his eyes sharp and focused. "Safety first. Keep your finger off the trigger until you're ready to fire. Always." He patted the barrel of the rifle. "And never point this at anything you don't intend to shoot, even if your shoelace comes undone." I nodded, overwhelmed by the sudden influx of information and the weight of responsibility. He ran through the basics: stance, breathing, sight alignment, each step a hurdle in my current state of nervousness. He set up a target with a red dot in the center and gestured for me to aim. I raised the rifle, awkwardly attempting to replicate his earlier instructions. Sweat slicked my palms as I squinted down the iron sights, the paper target blurring slightly from the effort. "Take a deep breath and hold it," he instructed, his voice calm amidst my rising panic. "That'll help steady your aim." I inhaled deeply, the air catching in my throat. The world seemed to shrink to a tunnel. The sights and the target were the only things in focus. With a trembling finger, I squeezed the trigger. The gun roared, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. A jolt of surprise ran through me, followed by a wave of relief. The spent casing clattered to the floor, and a small plume of smoke drifted upwards. "Not bad," Grandpa said, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. He walked over to the target and examined it. "Bullseye on your first try? It looks like you might be a natural after all." 3 months blurred into one another, the rhythm of training becoming a grim soundtrack to our lives. The initial trembling in my hands gave way to a practiced grip, and the sting of gunpowder in my nostrils was replaced by a steely resolve. With each successful shot, a sliver of fear chipped away, replaced by a cold determination. But the nightmares remained, vivid snapshots of the creature's horrifying form, a constant reminder of the darkness we were about to face. One crisp morning, the silence in the house felt heavy. Grandpa emerged from the back room, a weathered backpack slung over his shoulder. The weight of the pack seemed symbolic, a physical manifestation of the burden we were about to carry. Inside lay a tent, rations, and our grim arsenal. He met my gaze. His eyes were a mixture of grief and determination. For a beat, the weight of the situation pressed down on us, a silent acknowledgement of the danger that lurked ahead. Then, with a nod, he broke the silence. "Let's go get your mom." We rumbled down the familiar road in my grandpa's truck, the air thick with unspoken dread. Every creak and groan of the vehicle seemed amplified, a reminder of the approaching danger. Finally, we pulled up to my mom's house, a house that now felt haunted by her absence. We walked towards the tree line, the woods looming before us. My pulse hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs, the silence broken only by the crunch of dead leaves under our boots. It felt like the entire forest held its breath, waiting. We located a barely there trail, a faint hope amidst the dense foliage. It snaked deeper into the woods, a single path. We followed it for what felt like an eternity, the minutes stretching into hours. The sunlight, dappled and weak, barely pierced the thick canopy of trees, casting long, unsettling shadows that danced at the corner of my vision. The trail eventually sputtered out into a dead end, a wall of tangled undergrowth blocking our way. But amidst the thicket, there was a narrow opening. We squeezed through, emerging into a small clearing. I took a deep, shaky breath, trying to calm my escalating anxiety. My breaths came in ragged gasps, a stark contrast to my grandpa's steady demeanor. He'd seen his fair share of hardship in his military days, a fact that both comforted and terrified me. Here, in this untamed wilderness, a different kind of danger lurked, a primal threat, unlike anything he could have trained for. Across the clearing, another trail snaked away, a faint trail leading deeper into the woods. "There's another trail over there," I rasped, the words catching in my dry throat. "Yep, I see it," my grandpa replied, his voice betraying none of the apprehension I felt. We crossed the clearing, weariness clinging to us like a second skin. Hours bled into one another as we followed the new trail, scrutinizing every rustle in the undergrowth and every snap of a twig. The dappled sunlight filtered through the dense woods, casting shifting patterns on the forest floor. Suddenly, a noise ripped through the silence, a rhythmic pounding that grew louder and faster with each passing second. My heart lurched into my throat, and my eyes darted wildly through the trees, searching for the source. Then it bursted into view, a magnificent buck, its head crowned with a rack of antlers. It leaped across the trail a few feet in front of us, its powerful muscles rippling beneath its dappled coat. As quickly as it appeared, it vanished back into the undergrowth, leaving behind a fading echo of its snort. I let out a startled scream, adrenaline coursing through my veins. Relief washed over me as my grandpa chuckled, his hand resting on my shoulder. "It's just a buck," he said, his voice warm and reassuring. "Scared the heck out of you, didn't it?" I let out a shaky laugh, the tension finally breaking, and for the first time in a long while, I saw a genuine smile on my grandpa's face. It wasn't a wide, carefree grin, but a small flicker of joy that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "I miss that," he said quietly, his gaze distant. A single tear welled up in his eye, tracing a glistening path down his cheek. For a moment, I didn't understand what he meant. Then, It hit me. The smile, the laughter, they were things that had been missing from his life since Grandma passed. "Yeah, I know what you mean," I said softly, placing a comforting hand on his arm. The sun was beginning its descent. "We should find a place to camp soon," my grandpa said, his voice regaining its gruff composure. "We should also set up a fire to keep those mosquitoes away." He pointed off the trail, his gaze settling on a small clearing nestled amongst the towering trees. "What do you think?" "Yeah, that seems like a good spot," I agreed, stepping into the clearing. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves, the sound mingling with the rhythmic chirp of crickets hidden among the undergrowth. Grandpa bent down with a grunt, lowering his heavy backpack to the ground. He took out a flimsy tent, the worn fabric whispering a tale of countless camping trips. "Here, hold this part," he instructed, handing me a pole. I grasped it tightly as he took the opposite end, and together we stretched the fabric out. A rogue pole decided to put up a fight, stubbornly refusing to fit into its designated slot. We wrestled with it for a moment, a silent struggle punctuated by muttered curses, before finally snapping it into place with a satisfying click. Working together, we unfolded the tent, fed the poles through the sleeves, and staked it firmly into the ground. As we finished tying down the last flap, a wave of accomplishment washed over me. The flimsy structure now stood proudly. Stepping inside, I felt a sense of security. "Come out here for a second. I want to show you something," my grandpa called out. I crawled out of the tent, my muscles pleasantly achy from our work. He stood beside a pile of sticks he'd gathered, with a glistening piece of metal clutched in his hand. It wasn't the traditional lighters or matches I was used to. This was a flint and steel fire starter, a sleek metal device with a smooth handle and a jagged piece of flint protruding from its side. "This is how you can start a fire," he said with a hint of pride in his voice. "No fancy lighters or matches needed." He held it up and demonstrated, scraping the flint against a grooved metal pipe with a satisfying screech. A shower of tiny white-hot embers erupted, cascading down onto a pile of moss and dry leaves he'd carefully prepared. To my surprise, a small flame sputtered to life almost instantly. "See," he said, a grin spreading across his face. "Easy as pie. It wouldn't have been this simple back in my day, that's for sure." He gestured towards a nearby cluster of trees. "Go grab some more of those fallen branches over there. We'll need them to keep this fire going." I nodded and hurried towards the trees, pushing aside damp leaves in my search for usable branches. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows that danced across my grandpa's face. Regret etched deep lines around his eyes as he spoke, his voice hoarse with grief. "I should have believed her. Your grandmother. I don't think she'd blame me," he continued, his voice cracking slightly. "Who could believe something like that, right? I had every reason to be skeptical. But that damn skepticism..." He choked on the words, his gaze hardening as it settled on the fire. "It got your mom, my daughter, taken." He turned to me, his eyes filled with tears. "What does it look like? Your grandma never told me." The question ripped open a hole of fear within me. Memories I desperately buried flooded my mind. A grotesque tangle of limbs, eyes that glowed with an unnatural light, and the unearthly screech that still echoed in my nightmares. I squeezed my eyes shut, the taste of bile rising in my throat. He must have seen the struggle etched on my face, because after a beat of silence, he spoke again, his voice softer now. "Never mind, you don't have to talk about it." Silence engulfed us. The only sounds were the crackling fire and the frantic beat of my heart. Shame gnawed at me for failing to answer, but the memories were too horrific to relive. We sat there, each lost in our world of sorrow. Finally, unable to bear the tension any longer, I got up and retreated into the tent. My grandpa stayed behind, sitting on the ground, his eyes staring into the fire. Images of my mom, pale and captive, danced behind my closed eyelids. How could this creature keep her alive? What could she be going through? The questions gnawed at me relentlessly, offering no answers. Just as I drifted to sleep, I heard the soft rasp of the tent zipper opening, and my grandpa settling in beside me. But before I could turn and see his face, sleep claimed me completely. A sliver of sunlight pierced through the fabric of the tent, rousing me from sleep. The air inside smelled faintly of wood smoke and pine needles, a comforting reminder of the crackling fire outside. I stretched, the muscles in my back protesting slightly from the night spent on the uneven ground. As I emerged from the tent, a symphony of morning sounds greeted me. Birds chirped a cheerful melody from the branches overhead. The wind rustled the leaves in a gentle whisper, and the distant gurgle of a hidden stream added a peaceful counterpoint. But the peaceful melody was shattered the moment I saw my grandpa. He crouched beside the fire, a mug of coffee clutched tightly in his hand. His eyes were bloodshot, and his face had deep worry lines that seemed to have deepened overnight. He took a shaky sip of coffee, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "Good morning," he said, his voice gruff and strained. "Good morning," I mumbled back, a knot of dread tightening in my stomach. My appetite seemed to have vanished, but I forced myself to take a seat on the makeshift branch chair he'd fashioned and picked at the eggs he'd prepared. The silence stretched on as I ate. Finally, my grandpa cleared his throat. "I found something," he said, his voice low. "But I want you to stay calm." My heart plummeted. The anticipation was agonizing. He gestured towards a nearby tree, its rough bark illuminated by the golden rays of the morning sun. A shiver ran down my spine as I saw it. A deep gouge etched into the bark, a mark I recognized all too well. The same grotesque splayed imprint of multiple fingers, identical to the handprint on my windowpane. "I think we're getting closer to it," my grandpa said, his voice tight with fear. The words sent a fresh wave of terror crashing over me. As we took down the tent and packed our supplies, I noticed the trail we were following led directly towards the marked tree. With each step we took, the weight of dread grew heavier, the forest pressing in on us with a renewed sense of menace. As we walked, my grandpa suddenly ended the silence. "Stop!" my grandpa rasped, his voice tight with sudden urgency. I skidded to a halt. He crouched low, his gaze fixed on the ground in front of me. A knot of dread formed in my stomach as I followed his line of sight. There, imprinted in the soft earth, was a footprint, unlike any animal track I'd ever seen. It was small, but the details were sharp and unsettling. 4 rows of perfectly round indentations, each one leaving a mark like the point of a needle. Multiple rows of these prints veered off the trail and disappeared into the dense undergrowth. "Let's follow it," my grandpa muttered, his voice a mere tremor. Despite the tremor in his voice, there was a steely glint in his eyes. I knew arguing was pointless. We had come too far to turn back now. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a machete, the worn blade glinting in the dappled sunlight. He began hacking away at the undergrowth, creating a makeshift path. I followed close behind, my eyes glued to the ground, tracking the trail of unearthly footprints. The prints continued for about 10 feet, leading deeper into the tangled undergrowth. Then, abruptly, they stopped. It was as if the creature that made them had simply vanished into thin air. One moment, the prints were there, clear and unmistakable. The next, they were gone, leaving no further trace. I stared at the space where the trail had disappeared, a cold dread seeping into my bones. The hours melted into each other, creating a blur of green foliage and tangled undergrowth. We had strayed so far from the original path that even the familiar scent of pine needles seemed distorted and tainted with a hint of decay. The rising urgency to find our way back only intensified the sense of isolation pressing down on us. As we walked in an aimless direction in hopes of relocating the footprints, a sound emanated from deep within the woods. It sounded close but far away at the same time, a sound that sent shivers down my spine, a high-pitched screech that echoed through the trees, rising and falling in an erratic rhythm. It wasn't the cry of any animal I'd ever heard. My grandpa's face, already etched with worry, was drained of color, his grip tightened on the machete, his knuckles white against the worn wood. He steered us away from the sound, towards a small clearing, a pitiful excuse for a campsite. We set up the tent with frantic urgency. The silence between the screeching shrieks was thick with dread. Inside the cramped tent, the smell of mildew and fabric was suffocating. "What in the hell could that be?" my grandpa rasped, his voice barely a whisper. My heart hammered against my ribs, mirroring the echo of the screech that had faded into an unsettling low growl. I I don't know, I said, voicing the unspoken fear that hung heavy in the air. His eyes darted towards the tent flap. No campfire tonight, he said, his voice rough. I knew it wasn't just the danger of attracting attention. He was terrified to leave the flimsy shelter of the tent. The moon cast an eerie glow through the fabric, painting the interior with a ghostly light. I found myself fixated on the shadows dancing across the tent wall, the innocent shapes of trees twisting into forms in my overactive imagination. Then, a sliver of movement caught my eye. A shadow darted across the illuminated canvas, a fleeting glimpse of something dark and fast. There was no sound, no rustle of leaves, no snap of twigs. Just silence, a horrifying silence that made the movement seem even more unnatural. "Grandpa," I whispered, my voice barely above a tremor. "Something's moving outside the tent." He whipped his head toward me, his eyes wide with terror. The shadow moved again, a dark shape flitting behind another tree, a tree closer to us. My grandpa saw it too. His breath hitched and his eyes bulged. Then, with a swift movement, he reached into his backpack and pulled out his pistol. I watched the shadow. It was completely still until it wasn't. The shadow, the thing, ran so fast, so silently, that I had no time to brace myself. Grandpa's hand clamped over my mouth, stifling the scream that threatened to escape. The shadow, a semi-human or something else, slammed against the tent, its weight causing the fabric of the tent to billow inward. A putrid stench, a sickly mix of decay, assaulted my nostrils. Then it started to sniff our tent. The tent sucked inward with each inhale, the sound of wet, raspy breaths filling the confined space. I looked at Grandpa. His face was etched with terror, but a flicker of something else, defiance maybe, or a desperate attempt to appear strong for my sake. Warm tears streamed down my face as his hand remained clamped firmly over my mouth. The sound that pierced the silence next was a sickening rasp, the sound of the tent zipper being unzipped. A surge of adrenaline coursed through me. Somehow, this thing had figured out the purpose of the zipper in a horrifyingly short amount of time. Grandpa, whose eyes narrowed, raised his pistol, his finger hovering over the trigger. The zipper hissed open, revealing a gaping maw filled with razor-sharp teeth. Grandpa let off round after round, and before I could even think, a skeletal arm, impossibly thin and tipped with a spidery claw, shot out of the darkness and wrapped itself around Grandpa's leg. Memories of my mom flooded back, a vivid nightmare replaying in my mind. I wouldn't let it happen again. Grabbing the machete that lay near the tent flap, I lunged forward, fueled by a primal rage. With a bone-crunching slice, I brought the blade down on the arm, severing it clean from the creature's body. There was no scream, no roar of pain. The severed limb twitched for a moment, then snapped back into the darkness. The creature, recoiling as if stung, retreated into the trees with an unnatural silence. "We have to run now!" Grandpa screamed, his voice rough with urgency. He slung his backpack over his shoulder, and together we scrambled out of the tent. We sprinted blindly through the woods, the darkness surrounding us in a swirling mass of shadows and unseen dangers. I forced myself to slow down, glancing back to see if Grandpa was keeping pace. He was there, but stumbling. Then a new wave of terror washed over me. In the distance, perched on a low-hanging branch, was a humanoid silhouette with skin as black as coal, 4 spindly legs, and a head composed entirely of glowing eyes. It leaped from branch to branch, a silent stalker keeping pace with us. "It's following us!" I screamed, pointing towards the creature. Grandpa whipped his head around, his face contorted in a mask of horror. "Jesus Christ! What is that thing?" He bellowed, his voice a desperate scream into the uncaring night. A steep hill came into view, a tangle of loose rocks and undergrowth. With a shared look of desperate hope, we sprinted towards it, the chilling laughter of the creature echoing in our ears. We didn't slow down, didn't hesitate. We threw ourselves down the incline, the rocks and sticks tearing at our clothes and skin. I landed with a painful thud at the bottom, the frigid water of a small pond shocking me back to my senses. I lifted my head from the rocks. "Grandpa!" I croaked, the taste of blood metallic in my mouth. A wave of nausea washed over me, and my vision blurred. The last thing I remembered was scrambling to my feet and calling out for Grandpa. Then, darkness. A gentle hand shook my shoulder, pulling me back from unconsciousness. I snapped awake, blinking against the harsh sunlight that made my eyes sting. "Relax, it's me." Grandpa's voice was raspy, rough, and strained. I pushed myself up, wincing at the throbbing pain in my leg. A smear of dried blood stained Grandpa's forehead. "What should we do?" I asked, fear and urgency knotting my stomach. "We have to keep moving," he croaked back, his voice weak. Ignoring him, I stood still for a moment, my eyes darting across the darkening landscape. Every rustle and every creak had my full attention. Then, on the opposite end of the pond, I spotted it. A barely noticeable trail, barely visible through the dense thicket. "Let's follow that trail," I said, pointing towards it. Grandpa flicked his gaze between me and the trail, a storm of emotions brewing in his eyes, fear battling with deep-seated defiance. I knew he wanted to quit, yet the man I knew wouldn't back down from a challenge. With a defeated sigh, his shoulders slumped slightly. He brushed the dirt from his arms in a seemingly mundane gesture, a nervous tick in the tense atmosphere. Finally, he met my gaze. "All right," he said, his voice low but steady. "Let's go." I noticed it immediately as we walked on the trail, the same footprints branded into the ground, sending a fresh wave of terror crashing through me. My heart began racing again as we followed the tracks. Then, a sound, an unmistakable sound, pierced the tense silence. A sound I knew well, a sound etched into the very fabric of my being. A soft, guttural moan. It was Mom. I knew it was. No one could tell me otherwise. I whipped my head in the direction of the sound, and a primal scream clawed its way up my throat, dying strangled in my parched mouth. Stretched between two trees, dominating the isolated trail, hung the most monstrous spiderweb I had ever laid my eyes on. It wasn't a delicate net spun by a garden spider. This was something entirely different, shimmering with an unnatural mossy white. Trapped in its sticky center, like a fly caught in a death trap, was my mother. Her entire body was cocooned in the sticky strands, a horrifying parody of a spider's meal, except for her head. Her face was drained of color, pale as moonlight, but her eyes were wide open, filled with a vacant terror that mirrored my own. The urge to scream her name was a physical ache in my chest. But there, clambering across the sticky strands with unnatural agility, was the creature itself. It was a grotesque parody of a spider, a blasphemy against nature. It had a humanoid torso and coal-black skin, its spidery legs contorted at impossible angles, clicking and scraping against the web. My grandpa grabbed me, pulling me full force down behind a log. Somehow, it hadn't seen us. Relief, sharp and unexpected, flooded through me. My heart hammered in my chest as I imagined the creature making its way just above us. For a moment, a tense silence blanketed the woods, broken only by the ragged gasps escaping my lips. I stole a peek through a knothole in the log, the world tilting on its axis as I took in the horrifying scene. The creature scuttled across its intricate web, its movements deliberate and predatory. Every black leg seemed to tap out a strange sort of rhythm, a rhythm of impending doom. Beside me, I heard my grandpa inhale a shaky breath. I slowly turned my gaze towards him, bracing myself for the fear that would surely be etched on his face. But what I saw instead was a different kind of emotion entirely. Acceptance. A quiet resolve hardened his features. It was the look of a man who had made a choice in his mind, a choice that gnawed at him, but a choice he knew he had to make. In a low and shaky whisper, my grandpa said, "I'm going to distract it." "What?" I spat back, completely caught off guard. He squeezed my shoulder, his grip surprisingly strong for a man who looked like a gust of wind could knock him over. "Listen, I don't have much fight left in me anymore, but maybe, just maybe, I can be useful one last time. Your mom, my daughter, she needs you. Just promise me you'll get her to safety. Promise me you'll never come back here looking for me." His eyes, once filled with determination, were now clouded with a deep sadness that seemed to suck the light out of him. Tears welled up in the corners of his eyes, threatening to spill. I swallowed the lump in my throat. The air was thick enough to chew on. "I promise," I choked out, a single tear tracing a path down my cheek. He brushed it away with a rough thumb, his touch surprisingly gentle. "There is no time for tears. Be strong, take care of your mother and yourself. I love you. Tell your mom I love her too, but don't tell her what happened." Then, in a move that defied his age and condition, he leaped to his feet, ran out from behind the log, and roared, "Come and get me, you motherfucker!" The creature on the web snapped its head around, its multiple eyes locking onto my grandpa. With a screech that sent shivers down my spine, it launched itself off the web and hurled towards him. Though my grandpa already had a head start, because the second he screamed, he was already running, tempting the thing to chase him, and it did. His plan worked. This was my chance. I scrambled out from behind the log, my heart hammering. She hung suspended in the web. Ignoring the throbbing pain that had taken root in my arms, I reached out and tore at the sticky strands, fueled by a frantic desperation that coursed through me like a shot of adrenaline. They clung stubbornly, but I wouldn't give up. Finally, with a satisfying rip, she tumbled free, landing at my feet. Disoriented and mumbling a name that wasn't mine, she looked at me with vacant eyes. Eyes that I couldn't tell were of recognition or something else. I hoisted her over my shoulder, surprising myself with a surge of strength that seemed to come from nowhere. Ignoring the exhaustion gnawing at my bones, I picked a direction and ran, plunging deeper into the woods. Every rustle of leaves and every snap of a twig sent fresh jolts of fear through me. The forest floor blurred beneath my feet as I ran, my lungs burning and my legs screaming in protest. But the urge to survive propelled me forward. Then, it ripped through the air, a sound that sent shivers down my spine and turned my blood to ice. A blood-curdling scream, raw and filled with unimaginable pain. It echoed from somewhere deep within the woods behind me, a horrifying confirmation of my worst fears. My grandpa's scream, the image of the creature, its monstrous form enveloping him, flashed in my mind like a horrific nightmare. I didn't need to see it to know his fate. The scream spoke volumes, a testament to the sacrifice he made to buy me time. A wave of nausea crashed over me, the taste of bile rising in my throat. But I forced it down, clinging to the one sliver of hope. Mom. Desperation fueled my flight. The forest floor blurred beneath my burning feet, my vision swimming with tears I couldn't afford to shed. Just as despair threatened to engulf me, a sliver of hope pierced through the dense foliage. A clearing, and within it, a sight that sent a jolt through my entire being. A river. A memory flickered to life. A precious memory from a happier time. My grandpa, his voice tinged with the wisdom of countless adventures, taught me a crucial survival rule. Follow the river downstream, kiddo. Sooner or later, it'll lead you to civilization, or at least the ocean. Hours bled into one another as I followed the river's flow. The relentless sun began its descent, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and red. The weight of Mom on my back was a constant ache, a stark reminder of the burden I carried. She remained silent, the only sign of life the shallow rise and fall of her chest with each labored breath she took. My legs had become numb. I moved in a daze, a sleepwalker propelled by sheer will. Hours bled into one another, measured by the monotonous gurgle of the river and the rhythmic rise and fall of Mom's chest against my back. Then, a flicker of sensation returned to my legs, a prickling numbness that chased away the dull ache. Hope, flickering like a dying ember, flared back to life. As I crested a small rise, the world seemed to stop spinning entirely. There, slicing through the dense trees, was a sight that brought tears to my stinging eyes. A road. A strangled laugh, a sound raw with emotion, escaped my lips. With a burst of adrenaline that defied my exhaustion, I lurched forward, a desperate parody of a run. My legs, regaining some semblance of life, propelled me towards the asphalt ribbon. Cars whizzed by in a blur, the sound a symphony of hope. I stumbled onto the road, heedless of the danger, my voice hoarse from exhaustion. "Help us!" Two words, desperate and raw, ripped from my throat. Just as a speeding truck loomed into view, its horn blaring, it screeched to a halt mere inches from my outstretched hand. The driver, a grizzled man with a face etched with the lines of a life well lived, peered down at me, his eyes widening in surprise. He didn't waste time with questions. "Get in!" he barked, his voice gruff but kind. I settled Mom gently into the passenger seat, her body a fragile weight against mine. The driver grunted in acknowledgement, his gaze flickering to her pale face for a fleeting moment. "Hospital," he rumbled, his voice gruff but not unkind. I managed a weak nod, my throat tight with unshed tears. "Lucky you," he muttered, his weathered face creased in a hint of a smile. "There's one just up ahead." The engine roared to life, the comforting rumble pulling me from the edge of sleep. As the familiar scenery of trees blurred past the window, they morphed into a terrifying tapestry of memories. Every rustle of leaves and every snap of a twig echoed with the memory of the creature and the desperate struggle for survival. Finally, the frantic pace of the car slowed as we pulled into a brightly lit hospital entrance. Relief washed over me, a tidal wave threatening to drown me in its intensity. With trembling hands, I helped the driver get Mom out of the truck and into a waiting wheelchair. Now, as I sit beside her in a sterile hospital room, the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor fills the room. The doctor's words echo in my ears. "She'll be all right." Those words are a lifeline, a fragile hope that I cling to with all my might. My gaze rests on Mom's peaceful face, and the memory of her soft, comforting hand is a beacon in the darkness. Getting her back was all that mattered. But at what cost? The answer hangs heavy in the air, a silent tribute to the man who taught me strength in the face of despair, my grandpa. And that's it for today. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like it, subscribe, and leave a comment letting me know what you think. Relax, unwind, and get some sleep. See you in the next video.